My name is Reverend Catherine Light, and I am the pastor here at Elm Street Congregational Church, and I welcome you to our Tuesday night Bible study. We have been in the book of 1 Samuel looking at the life of David, who becomes the king of Israel immediately after the first king, King Saul. So what we know is that there are two different stories kind of being woven together. One where David was a little shepherd boy, and one where he was an accomplished soldier. And tonight we're going to have David and Jonathan meet. And let's say a word of prayer, and then we'll get to our study. Holy God, our Father and our Mother, thank you so much for allowing us to be here and for giving us the gift of the Bible so that we might look into the history of our faith and discover the things that will help us move forward in our discipleship. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, hello, Christine. I'm glad you could join us tonight. If you would like, when you can sign in, just like we do on Sunday morning. And I'm going to start by reading the first couple verses in chapter 18. So right before this, Saul had gone out against saw David go out against the Philistines. And he asked his helper, his personal assistant, Abner. He said, "Who is that young man?" And Abner says, I don't know. And so they get David to come in, and this is what David says to Saul. So on David's return from killing the Philistines, so the Goliath story, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and the head of the Philistine is in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." All right, so that's where we left off. We did the Goliath thing, and that David got in trouble with his brothers. We talked about two different stories running together here. Now, this is what happens in verse 18. This is very important because this is where we meet Jonathan. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and bow, and his belt. So here's what happens. We don't get why this happened, right? We don't know why. We don't know if this is love at first sight. We don't know if this is a political gesture. We don't know if Jonathan knows something about David that his father doesn't know. But we do know that there is a bond, a covenant, an agreement between these two men. So when I looked up the word that's used for love in Hebrew in this first verse, it is a word that I couldn't find in the Strong's Reference Bible under the word love. But I did look at some other places, and it said that this could be a political loyalty. And it's not the same word for love that we get in the later verses when Saul's daughter Michal loved David, because when Saul's daughter Michal loved David, that word actually has the meaning of to love God, because the first time we see that is in reference to God in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 5, and it's in a reference to thou shalt love the Lord your God, which is the the thing that Hebrew people or Jewish people still recite today when they recite the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and keep his commandments. It's mitzvah on your coming in and going out, when you're lying down and getting up. You can go and read that. I think it's verses 4 to 8 in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So the word that's used is u-e-ab. Now, my Hebrew is a little rusty, and we have a hard time whenever we have a whole bunch of vowels strung together, right? That's not natural for us as English speakers. We get two vowels together, we only want to pronounce one, so we pick one, either the first one or the last one, that's one we pronounce. Or we combine them in such a way that doesn't sound either like the first one or like the second one. It sounds like a totally different vowel, but we're not using spelling because English is crazy. So, so we're going to really wrestle with this idea that David and Jonathan are bonded. For most of the things that I've read, they have been so we have to remember how things are translated. So when you translate something, you are translating it through a set of rules that are not just grammatical, but that have to do with what you believe is going on in the chapter. So when one man loves another man and they have a covenant together, because our history is rife with homophobia and with saying, well, God said this was a horrible thing in Leviticus, so it can't be that. When in fact, it may be that, because a lot of times God will say, well, you know, something's not any good. And then we have Moabites are no good. And just kill them. They're terrible. They're no good. And then we get the story of Ruth, who's a Moabite. And then all of a sudden, Moabites weren't good. Now they are. So it could be that this is a love relationship. And we'll go, as we go through the chapters and as we look at the things that David says about Jonathan, we will see if that's a possibility. So I'm going to read a little more in this chapter because there's a little more going on to the story. So this is palace intrigue. We would be watching this. It would be a soap opera on television. And Saul, you know, David kills Goliath. Saul says, who are you? He says, I'm David. And Saul says, well, you can't go home. You have to stay with me. And then that's when the trouble starts, because then Jonathan falls in love with David, has a covenant with David. And here's what it says about David after that covenant is made. And Jonathan gives him all his symbols of royalty. So the things that Jonathan gives him are his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. These are all symbols of position, of power, of wealth. And he gives them to David. Almost like a bride price. All right? And we'll learn about what that is later in the chapter. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on, so I watched him. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house, while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. So now we get back to David being the warrior that played the musical instrument that was supposed to soothe Saul. So this is where that second tradition comes weaving into this chapter. And David was playing the lyre as he did day by day, and Saul had his spear in his hand and saw through the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And David marched out and came in, leading the army. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all of Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in, leading them. So, in the ancient world, the king did not sit in the background, he led the battles. And when we first were introduced to Saul, we learned that he is an old man. He's got adult children. And he sends David out instead. And it says a spirit, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul. So I want to reiterate that we are in a book, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd King, where we don't get a Satan figure or a devil figure yet. Everything that's good and everything that's bad is done by God. So if an evil spirit comes upon you, then that is because God sent it. Now, when we would read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we'll find out that in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which tells the same stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, tells the same stories, abbreviated. We'll find there if something bad happens, it's attributed to Satan. So let me just say one quick thing about that. 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are written prior to the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile happens, and for 50 years, the top 10, 15% of Jewish society, the landowners, the nobility, anybody that had any education, were taken to Babylon. And then they were freed by the Persians. I think it's Xerxes I. It could be Darius. So I won't say. I don't know which one it was. But here's what happened. The Persians were practicing a religion that we call Zoroastrianism, because the original prophet was named Zoroaster. And Zoroastrianism has a good God and a bad God that are in constant duels. They constantly battle for the cosmos. And so the Jewish people picked up this idea on their way back from Babylon with the Persians. And as the Persians were in contact with them, in fact, the Persian king actually thought that they worshiped the good God that he worshiped. And that may be true, I don't know whether or not that's the same God. But we can see a really big division on anything that's written after the Babylonian exile and anything that's written before. Because afterwards, there's an idea that there is an evil God and a good God. And we call that God and Satan. That's how we work that out in Christianity. And even in modern rabbinic Judaism, there is a Satan character. But in ancient Israel, there wasn't. So we go to Genesis and we call the serpent the Satan. We're reading that in. That's our midrash about that story. That's not actually in the text. We have read that into the text. But I digress too much. I'm sorry. Okay, so Saul becomes afraid of David, so he puts him out in front of an army and says, go kill me some Philistines. David goes, and he does really well. And then when he gets back, he gets very upset because the success has caused all of Israel and Judah, that means the northern and southern kingdoms that are ruled by Saul, to love David. They just think he's the best thing. And so Saul, who's got this evil spirit on him, is feeling very depressed and jealous and paranoid, is trying to plot to get rid of David. So he does some really interesting things. So then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab, and I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, this is what he thought now, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him." David said to Saul, "Who are my kinfolk, my father's family in Israel, that I would be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Saul's daughter Merab should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholite as a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And Saul was told, and the thing pleased him, because Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may become a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David, "A second time, you shall now be my son-in-law." Saul commanded his servant David, "Speak to David in private and say, 'See, the king is delighted with you, and all his servants love you.'" Now that love that being used in the 22nd verse is a political love. And it's a different word, but it's Uthreb. So that's different than the word that we had between David and Jonathan. That was a different word. And I'm still working on trying to pin that down. Sometimes the words are awful hard to find in other texts so that you can read where it's used. They call it a word study so they can see how it's used in other places. Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private and say, 'See, the king is delighted with you, and all his servants love you, and now then become the king's son-in-law.'" So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private, and David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man of no repute?" The servants of Saul told him, "This is what David has said." And then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines." So you know what a foreskin is? It's the extra skin on the end of the penis. So not only now does he have to kill 100 Philistines, but he has to do the little circumcision thing. And he said that he may avenge on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servant told David these words, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law before the time had expired. So David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. But when Saul realized that the Lord was with David, and that Saul's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. Then the commander of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, and so that his fame became great. So we set up some different relationships here. So we've got Jonathan and David together, who had a covenant together. Then we have David and Michal, Jonathan's sister, and they have a marriage, and we'll have to see how that works out for them. Because I think David does marry several women. So to say that David was gay would probably not be correct. To say that David might have been bisexual may be correct. We don't know. And these are things that we need to explore. And it's okay to ask the question. And it's okay to come to different answers, because there's no sentence in the Bible that says, and this is the way it was. So we are responsible for a lot of things when we interpret the text. And I hope that you read that whole chapter through yourself. See if you have a study Bible, see what your study Bible says. You need to have a study Bible that's probably less than 20 years old. let me know if you need one. I might be able to find one for you here. And I pray that together, when we study the Bible, we become discerners of the Word. And so why is this an important thing to discern? This is an important thing to discern because a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters see the LGBTQ community as enemies. Now, they shouldn't, because Christians don't have enemies. And if they do, it's because they're coming after them and they're supposed to love them. But there is a division in Christianity between those who are open and affirming and those who are not. And those who are not use particular passages in the Bible to bolster their prejudices. So I have to say that if you are a confessing Christian, then your orientation to everyone is love. And saying that, well, this is a horrible sin, misses the whole point of what sin is. Sin is anything we do that misses the mark from God. So if you're a gossip, like if you like to gossip and talk about people all the time, that is a sin. That's a sin that Jesus actually talks about. He never talks about homosexuality or lesbians or transgender. He doesn't talk about that. But he does talk about people who get haughty, right? And he does talk about people who don't share. He does talk about people who hoard their wealth and don't care for the poor. Those are the sins that Jesus talks about. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there are cultural sins and there are sins. And many of our brothers and sisters want to make cultural sins of God that are worse than like other sins. But the deal is that all sins are equal, but some tear up communities more. So the sin of gossip will tear a community apart like that. The sin of bearing false witness, like that. So we need to be mindful. I am so glad that you spent this time with me. I see we're about our 20 minutes. I want to say thank you for coming to Bible study. I hope you found this informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to message me or text me, and I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my abilities. And join us next week when we read chapter 19. And we find out that Saul is really going to go after David. And he tells Jonathan about it, and then Jonathan reports back to David. So, God bless, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.